Katie Mooring. I was wondering about the children that grow up within Scientology. How are they legally able to avoid going to regular non-Scientology schools and have time to be in the cadet org or whatever the pre-Sea org for young children is? Okay, I think there's a lot of confusions about the subject of kids and Scientology, and so we're going to need to differentiate a few things here. And I've talked about before the fact that there are different levels of involvement in Scientology. You have public Scientologists who just pay their money and do their courses and do their auditing and they go up the bridge, right? And that's public Scientologists. Then you have staff members, higher level of commitment and obligation. They sign a contract, they work at the churches. And then you have the Sea organization, which is 24/7, fully committed. That's all they do, all day, every day, and it's a paramilitary group. And that is your highest level of commitment to Scientology. So 3 levels of this. So now when it comes to kids, Scientologists have kids, right? Public Scientologists have families, they're living their life, they're doing their thing. Those kids are not subject to any Scientology rules. If the parents want to bring the kids into a Scientology church, have them do Scientology courses, have them go to a private Scientology school that they pay for, that's run by Scientologists, that's all up to them. It's totally voluntary, totally 100% on them as to how much their kids are involved in Scientology. I grew up in Scientology, so my involvement in it was actually fairly minimal until I was a teenager. I did a few courses, I didn't really like it. I knew the lingo, I grew up around it, but it really wasn't the thing that I thought I needed to be doing until I changed my mind when I went in at 15 years old and did a personality test. So I went to regular public school all that time, and for a very, very, very brief time as a young child, I went to a private Scientology school, which was called an Apple school in the LA area, and but it was too expensive for my parents to keep me going to it, and they pulled me out of it. So that is basically the level of involvement of Scientology children who are the children of public Scientologists. Now, same with staff members, right? Same drill, because staff members are really just public Scientologists who sign a contract and work at the Denver Church of Scientology or the Milano Church of Scientology or the Keokuk Church of Scientology. Their kids don't go to the church and start getting free services, and they don't go to the church and get, full-time service or something. That's not, they're just regular kids going to regular school. Now, when you get to the Sea organization is when things get crazy and very, very abusive, especially for the kids. Because if a person joins the Sea organization, they might have kids. And if the kids come in with them, the kids are subject to having to go to school. And this has evolved over the years. It's a changing situation, right? So when we talk about kids in the Sea Org in the 1970s or 80s, it's a bit of a different situation than the way the kids are handled now. The kids are kind of discouraged now because there's been so much bad PR for the church about kids. Now they're kind of like, I don't think we want to recruit kids into the Sea Org. I don't think we want to bring families into the Sea Org because we don't have anything to do with the kids. Or it's kind of hard to deal with the kids because kids just run around and do what they do, right? So, but it wasn't always that way. In the 70s and in the 80s, Sea Org members who were full-time, flat out, working for the church would sometimes get pregnant and they would have their kids. And then the Sea Org had to deal with the kids. And so they established nurseries and they established this thing called a cadet org, the cadet organization that was supposed to deal with these kids. And they put a couple of total, misfit failures in charge of the thing. There was the people they could spare to deal with the kids. And so the kids ran around in these awful conditions because the Sea Org didn't give a shit about them. And the kids were sort of left to their own devices. They were running around in the hands of people who didn't know what they were doing, didn't have the money or the resources to feed the kids and clothe the kids well and take care of the kids. And so the kids it was a disaster. And you read books about, Jenna Miscavige, David Miscavige's niece, right? She grew up at the Int Ranch. They had ranches set up in Los Angeles and up at the international base in San Jacinto, where they took care of these kids for a while, and the conditions were just awful, and they treated them like little adults and not kids, and they basically abused the hell out of them, right? So that happened. Then in the 90s, when I was in the Sea Org in Los Angeles, it went from that abusive, awful kind of situation to having to make attempts to comply with the law because those kids were now grown up. Some of those kids had grown up and were telling their story, and it was reflecting bad on the church. So the Office of Special Affairs said, okay, we got to crack down and deal with this. And so the kids who were there started getting schooling. They started putting in a school, and they got, one of the Sea Org members, his name was Jesse, got some accreditation or took on a teacher role and taught the kids. And he took them out on field trips, and he, had put a curriculum together and was using Scientology study technology, but he had some curriculum of art and history and math and science that he had written. And honestly, from what I observed, he had a pretty good head on his shoulders, and he really did want these kids to succeed. Now, that's just what I directly observed in Los Angeles. I'm not speaking broadly for this is what went down in England or at Flag and Clearwater. This is just what I saw in LA. And this was in the late 90s and more into the 2000s, really, is when this really kind of became a thing with the schooling. And at that point, these kids were Sea Org members themselves. And we're not talking about 5-year-olds. We're talking about, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. And so they would do 5 hours or 6 hours or however many hours were required by law of schooling. And then they would go do post-work. And then they were supposed to go to bed at 10 o'clock. Because that was the law. They were only supposed to work so many hours a day, and the Office of Special Affairs guys would periodically check in and try to make sure they were doing that. But the Sea Org being the Sea Org and the nature of the whole activity being insane, oftentimes, all the time, these kids were dragged around and made to work late nights, skip school, right? The school was sort of always, while there was an effort being made by Jesse and by others to try to enforce it and try to put it in, there was the push-pull of the Sea Org and the Sea Org is what it is, which is you got to get everything done now, and it's like and all this crazy work that gets shoved off on people. So the kids fall into that, and so they wouldn't be at school, or they'd skip school, or they would whatever would happen. And because the Sea Org was always the most important thing, and the school was always the second most important thing. So that's kind of how that evolved as far as what I saw with my own 2 eyes. I've heard horrible stories, and I believe almost all of them, from kids who grew up prior to this time, like they grew up in the 80s and the early 90s in the Sea Org, had totally different not totally different, sorry, but had totally horrifying experiences because this whole school thing wasn't really a thing before that, as I understand it. And the care that was given to these kids was always second rate. I don't want to, try to make this school thing that I observed more than what it was. It's just, I'm just telling you what I saw. So that's sort of how it's evolved. And I think, as I understand it, and from what I was told as a recruiter, when I was recruiting for the Sea Org in the late 2000s, 2010, 2011, when I was doing recruitment, we weren't going after kids. We were the lowest age we would go after for somebody was, 16 or 17 if we could get their parents' permission. It would depend on whether that was legal or not, whether we could get them to do that. And I think that depended on what state you were in, right? But for example, I never tried to recruit somebody who was, 12 or 10 or 11. But I have seen instances of that happen, even up to present time. So I know that those rules and guidelines are loosey-goosey, depending on how desperate people are. And when you recruit a kid into the Sea Org, then they're going to be subject to the laws and education and stuff, and they're going to need to go to school. So this has always been a big, huge problem for the Sea Org, and that's how they've, you know, chosen to deal with it to, you know, whatever degree of success that was. I wouldn't say that any of those kids, I wouldn't say that any of them, even the ones who were getting the most attention and really trying, were getting a good education in the Sea Org. That is definitely true. You know, they were getting a curriculum put together by a guy who was in the Sea Org, who had no real background in education, no real formal education in education. So he's winging it, and it looked like he was, you know, winging it better than I could wing it. But, you know, would I trust my kids to that? You know, absolutely not. So, you know, that's about everything I can tell you about that from my own firsthand experience. But you can find tons of stories on the internet from people like Jenna Miscavige and others who have come forward and told what happened to them as kids. And I could not even pretend to summarize, you know, 10% of that in this short format show like this. So check those things out.